These are the last images of Adrianne Robert ever captured on camera. Clearwater, Florida. In the early hours of July 14, 2012, she had just left Diamond Dolls. It was the night before moving day, a night that seemed completely ordinary. The camera recorded her walking out through the club doors. It recorded a man running after her, holding the black scarf she had left on her chair. It recorded the two of them exchanging a few words before walking off together into the darkness. Just a few hours later, Adrianne was found dead in her apartment. So what happened after that moment, when the forgotten scarf was returned on camera? This is the story of Adrianne Robert, of how one incredibly small detail became the last marker the camera ever held onto, and of how investigators patiently pieced the truth together from fragments that at first seemed insignificant. Adrianne Robert was born on January 4, 1983, and grew up in Green, Maine. She attended the University of Maine, and after graduating, worked as a page designer for the Sun Journal in Lewiston. In 2007, she moved to the Clearwater, Florida area, a new life in a new state. There, she worked as a graphic artist and continued her education at the University of South Florida. By the summer of 2012, Adrianne was not going through a chaotic period in her life. There were no signs that she was in crisis. On the contrary, this was a time when her life seemed to be opening up. She was preparing to move in with her boyfriend, Justin Pounders. Her belongings were already packed. The plans were nearly complete. Ahead of her was a moving morning, and then a new life with the man she loved. She was still living with her roommate, Jay Lafew. And on the evening of July 13, 2012, one day before the move, the two decided to go out for a little while. A small night out to mark the end of one chapter before everything shifted into another. It was the kind of decision people make hundreds of times in their lives without thinking twice. Adrianne stepped into that night like someone getting ready to begin again. No one looking at that evening would have imagined it would become the final boundary between ordinary life and a criminal investigation. At around 10:30 p.m. on July 13th, Adrianne and Jay walked from their apartment to Diamond Dolls. The two locations were only about a mile and a half apart. No car needed, no complicated plan, just a simple walk out for the evening, close to home. Inside the club, the two sat near the stage, ordered drinks, and talked like they always did. At that point, nothing stood out. Nothing made that night look different from any other. Then, a stranger approached their table. He did not cause a scene. He did nothing obvious enough to be immediately seen as a threat. He simply sat down, joined their conversation, and drank with them. Jay later described him as a black man, fairly thin, with a goatee and a baseball cap. There was nothing remarkable about that description. What investigators would later determine, though no one knew it at the time, was that Thomas Hampton Frederick had arrived at Diamond Dolls around 5 o'clock that evening. He had been inside the club for 8 hours before sitting down at Adrianne and Jay's table. And when Adrianne stood up to leave, Jay later remembered that the man asked where she was going. Then he stood up too. At the time, it may have sounded like nothing more than a passing question, but placed in the context of everything that followed, it became a warning sign that appeared very early that night. No one just recognized it in the moment. At around 1:30 a.m. on July 14th, 2012, Adrianne Robert stood up and left Diamond Dolls. The next day was moving day. She decided to walk home alone. Jay stayed behind. The camera captured her stepping out through the club doors by herself, as if the rest of the night would unfold completely normally. Then, just seconds later, the camera captured one small detail. Thomas Hampton Frederick ran out after her. In his hand was the item she had accidentally left on the chair inside, a black scarf. He walked up and returned it to Adrianne. She stopped. The two exchanged a few brief words. There was no audio. No one knows exactly what they said, but it was at that moment that an interaction which could have ended inside the club was extended just beyond the doorway. After those few seconds, the two began walking in the same direction, out of the camera's view, toward Adrianne's apartment on Pinecone Circle. And that was the last image of Adrianne Robert ever captured on CCTV that night. A black scarf left behind on a chair, a gesture of returning it that looked like simple courtesy, a pause that lasted only a few seconds. Then the two disappeared into the darkness. Once they left the camera's view, the story entered its most terrifying gap. There were no more angles showing what happened in full. Only darkness between the moment Adrianne left the club and the moment she returned to her apartment. And in that darkness, someone saw something. A witness later said he saw Adrianne on the road. She was still wearing the dress she had worn all evening. Her shoes were in her hand. Her bare feet were hitting the pavement. Behind her, a man was running after her. That was not the image of two people out for a late-night walk. When someone picks up their shoes and runs in the middle of the night, it usually is not because they are trying to save a few seconds. It is because those few seconds have suddenly become more important than anything else. At the time the witness saw them, the scene may have looked only unusual. But once the full picture came together, that detail took on its true meaning. Adrianne had, at some point, tried to create distance. She was trying to get to the safest place she knew that night. And the safest place she was trying to reach was her apartment. At around 3:30 a.m., Jay LaFew came home. The bathroom door was closed. There was no sound. Jay called Adrianne's name. No answer. When he opened the door, he found Adrianne on the floor. She was wearing only a bra. There was a stab wound to the left side of her chest. The 911 call came immediately afterward. Paramedics arrived and pronounced Adrianne dead at the scene. When investigators entered the apartment, it showed them something that could not have been random. There were no signs of forced entry on the door. The danger had not come from outside in the form of someone breaking in. The question immediately shifted. How had it gotten inside? There were signs of a violent struggle inside, not only in the bathroom, but also in the bedroom. The toilet was broken. Adrianne had bruises on her body. She had not gone down without a fight. A section of the bed sheet had been cut out and taken away, as if someone clearly understood what might later make him pay for what he had done. And Adrianne's orange Jeep was no longer in the parking lot. The picture beginning to emerge for investigators was this. This was not one random moment of panic. It was a sequence of actions, confrontation, an effort to conceal evidence, and then a decision to leave. Adrianne left behind a chain of traces, not one single piece of evidence, but many small, scattered fragments. Investigators started with diamond dolls. The footage confirmed that she and Jay had been there that night. It captured Frederick sitting at the table with them. It captured him running after Adrianne to return the scarf. It captured the two of them walking off in the same direction. But investigators did not stop there. They turned back the clock. They reviewed footage from earlier in the day. And in that footage, they saw Frederick arriving at Diamond Dolls around 5 p.m. by taxi. A small detail, one cab ride. But from the cab company's records, they obtained the phone number Frederick used to book the ride. And that was when the case turned in a very important direction. That phone number was already in the Clearwater Police Department's database. A month earlier, on June 11th, an officer had encountered Frederick walking alone in the early morning and recorded his number in a suspicious persons report. A detail that seemed meaningless at the time. But it was precisely that detail which connected the cab ride to a specific name, Thomas Hampton Frederick. Still, having a name was not enough. Frederick had no prior criminal record in Florida. His DNA was not in any database. Police needed something stronger than any denial. A forensic link solid enough to place Frederick inside the home on Pinecone Circle. That was when the investigation entered its most patient phase. Beginning on July 16th, investigators started watching Frederick around the clock. They followed him to work. They watched him while he slept. They followed him when he went out at night. They waited. Then the moment came. Not during a chase, not during a loud search, just a cigarette butt thrown from a car window and landing on the ground. Investigators collected that sample, sent it to the Pinellas County Forensic Lab. And when the results came back, the DNA from that cigarette butt matched the DNA recovered from Adrianne's body and from the mattress inside her apartment. The camera placed Frederick beside Adrianne in her final known moments. Cab records led investigators to his identity. The phone number in the older police database confirmed that identity, and DNA tied it all back to the very apartment where Adrianne was found. On July 25, 2012, police arrested Frederick at his workplace, Hit Promotional Products in Largo. There was no resistance. After his arrest, Frederick admitted to investigators where he had hidden the murder weapon, a kitchen knife wrapped in the section of bedsheet he had cut out and taken with him when he left the apartment. In late January 2014, the case went to trial at the Pinellas County Criminal Justice Center. The trial lasted 4 days. Both the prosecution and the defense agreed on one thing: Thomas Hampton Frederick had killed Adrianne Robert. What they disagreed on was why and how. Prosecutor Noel Festa told the jury that Frederick had watched Adrianne throughout the night inside the club, followed her home, and then attacked her. She was stabbed once in the upper left chest, the wound going nearly 4.5 inches deep, and then left in the bathroom. The defense, led by attorney Lori Mahan, argued self-defense, that the two had been together consensually, that Adrianne had taken a knife and attacked Frederick first, and that the stabbing happened during a struggle in which Frederick was defending himself. The jury heard both versions. Then they went into deliberations. Less than 2 hours later, they returned. On January 31st, 2014, Thomas Hampton Frederick was found guilty of first-degree murder and grand theft auto. Judge Thane Covert sentenced him immediately afterward, life in prison without the possibility of parole. As police led Frederick out of the courtroom, he waved toward his family and said, "I love you." His mother and other relatives called back, "We love you too, baby. Don't worry about it." On the other side of the courtroom, Adrianne's mother, Lori Robert, clutched a photo of the two of them together and cried as the verdict was read. Adrianne's father, Mark Robert, later said he was elated with the outcome. He said sitting in the same room with the man who killed his daughter and keeping his composure had been incredibly difficult. He said Frederick showed no remorse at all, not even when the verdict was announced. The family had flown in from Maine to attend the entire trial. They stayed for a week. No sentence could bring Adrianne back to the moving morning she had been preparing for. No verdict could return her to the new apartment with Justin Pounders, back to her work as a graphic artist, or back to the smile her father would later describe as infectious. The only thing left was the truth, fully assembled so it would not be buried along with that night. And looking back from beginning to end, the most haunting part of this case is still the smallest details. A black scarf left behind on a chair inside the club. A taxi ride at 5 p.m. A phone number recorded in a report from the month before. A cigarette butt thrown out of a car window. Each one on its own looks insignificant. But once placed in the right position, they form a chain that cannot be broken. That is why Pinellas County Sheriff Bob Gualtieri described the case as being solved through modern technology and good old-fashioned police work. Not through one dramatic breakthrough, but through the patience of fitting each piece back into place. The Adrianne Robert case also leaves behind a more unsettling question for anyone watching. Danger does not always arrive in a form people recognize right away. Sometimes it comes from a man who sits down at the next table and stays near you for 8 hours without anyone noticing. From a casual question when someone stands up to leave. From a scarf returned at the door. And sometimes the most decisive moments do not look like turning points at all. They look too ordinary. That is why only in hindsight do people realize they were looking at the last moment before everything disappeared from view. Thomas Hampton Frederick is currently serving his sentence at Hardy Correctional Institution in Bowling Green, Florida. He will never be eligible for parole. This video is presented for educational and informational purposes only. All content is based on public information and public records, including arrest records, Pinellas County court records, and verified local news coverage. We always respect the presumption of innocence in every case discussed, and all conclusions in this narration reflect officially documented court outcomes. Thank you for watching Recent Crimes TV. We'll see you in the next video, and wherever you are tonight, stay safe.